if I tell you that the world's gonna end, if you have 15 minutes just to repeat all your friends, would you take the first?
Welcome to Fantasy 15, an advice podcast meant to answer all of your fantasy football questions, or at least as many as I can get to in 15 minutes. I'm your host, Zach Freed, and as always, we've only got 15 minutes. We're officially on the clock. This week ends the Truth Hurts series, where I've been going through each position comparing the top fantasy finishes on the year to the truth behind how those players actually finished. For example, last week we talked about A.J. Brown and how he finished as wide receiver 15, but if you look at week 7 on after Ryan Tannehill took over, he was really wide receiver 3. Today, we're looking at tight ends, and we'll be using half point per reception scoring to split the difference between standard and PPR leagues. Let's get to it. First on our list is Travis Kelce. He had an ADP of 1, so he paid off. You got exactly what you drafted. He would have finished as high as wide receiver 12, and if you take out week 17, where he hardly played, he was at wide receiver 8. So you really got a great value from the tight end position if you drafted Kelce early, because he basically gave you high-end wide receiver points in the tight end slot. He was first in receptions with 97, which would have put him at 7th among wide receivers, and he was first in yards with 1,229. He did dip a bit when Tyreek Hill went out, but overall he was pretty consistent. He was probably the most consistent tight end, and he's been the number 1 tight end now for the last 4 years, so he's someone you can count on year in, year out now. There was a pass touchdown regression from Mahomes this season, but I think this might have been his floor, especially with the injury. So I expect Kelce's touchdowns to go up a little bit from the 5 that he got this year. He had such a lead over the next position that there was 25 points separating him from number 2 on the list. Number 2 on the list is George Kittle. And it's really unfortunate that Marshawn Lynch has his whole Skittle thing, because Kittle's Skittles just really rolls off the tongue and would probably make that guy millions in marketing. I don't know. George, Skittles, hit me up. He had an ADP of 2 or 3 depending on your league, and he kind of paid off because even though he did miss some games, you knew he wasn't going to play, and you could kind of prepare. He was on the same pace as Travis Kelce. He just missed a couple games and was injured. And so you didn't get the same finish, but you did have about the same rate that you were looking at with Travis Kelce. He was 4th in receptions with 85, 3rd in yards with 1,053. He's the clear number 1 receiver on the team, including wide receivers. His blocking has recently shined, and so I don't see him as someone who really leaves the field very often. He's possibly the tight end 1 next year. I just don't see how you can take Kittle over Kelce, a guy who's been doing it for the last 4 years. Number 3 on the list is Darren Waller. And Waller is built primarily on receptions. He was 2nd in receptions with 90, 2nd in yards with 1,145. He only had 3 touchdowns. Foster Moreau, the tight end 2 on the team, had 5. Carr likes to check down a lot. There's been some talk recently about them getting rid of him and trying to replace their quarterback, so who knows what exactly that role would be for Waller going forward, but he did sign a big contract, so he'll definitely continue to be featured. Who's the quarterback is the big question in Las Vegas. Maybe they're going to draft a flashy wide receiver to try to bring some fans in with a higher scoring offense. I definitely expect Jacobs to be featured more as a pass catcher, and so some of that's going to take away the volume that Waller saw this season that really is where his value came. 4th on the list is Mark Andrews, and he was built entirely on touchdowns. He had 10. That is the same as Travis Kelce and George Kittle combined. The highest wide receiver had 11 touchdowns, so the 10 touchdowns from Mark Andrews was really impressive. He was 7th in receptions with 64, 5th in yards with 852, and his snap counts make no sense. Here they are: 42%, 53%, 53, 42, 53, 48, 58, 34, 51, 35, 41, 43, 15, 37, 53. So he was hardly getting over 50% of the snaps on his offense. So it's very rare to see the amount of points fantasy-wise that he put up with that limited role. There isn't really any other player to compare him to when it comes to snap counts that was actually rostered on fantasy leagues. He always seemed injured. He ended up playing, though. He only missed one game, so you did have to kind of prepare like you had a backup, but you never really needed it. There has to be some regression coming because, if nothing else, the Ravens are probably going to draft another tight end because they're treating him like Pokemon at this point and trying to just catch them all. Fifth on the list is Zach Ertz, and he was third in receptions with 88, fourth in yards with 916. He missed one game at the end of the season, but he flourished when there was no one else to throw to. He was tight end 2 from weeks 9 through 16 when the Eagles were just decimated with injury. Ertz really benefits from playing with Alshon Jeffrey because Alshon seems like he's always hurt. So then Ertz becomes the de facto number 1 receiver. This season, though, we saw Goddard kind of step up. He's a very capable tight end. There was a lot of talk about them running 2 tight end sets, which they did towards the end of the season and into the playoffs. They'll definitely go out and get some wide receiver help. They have to. After seeing what happened to them this season, they have to put some pieces in place, at least to prepare for possible injuries. There's always upside when you're playing Zach Ertz. He's a solid tight end, and he has the ability to be a top 3 guy if things break his way. 17 points separated him from the next person on the list. Number 6 was Austin Hooper. Hooper! He was tight end 1 through week 10, including a bye week. So that's one less game than most of the other players. And that's when he was injured and when he went out. So up until that point, Hooper was a big value because you probably got him very late. He ended up missing 3 games. He still finished 5th in receptions, and he was on pace to finish as tight end 3 if he wouldn't have missed those games. The question is whether or not Hooper was a level up this season, a lack of Mohamed Sanu, or possibly because their offensive line was so bad. The Falcons passed the most of anyone in the NFL this season, and Matt Ryan had to check down a lot because he had no time. He had no protection. So originally that saw Mohamed Sanu getting a lot of catches, and then once Sanu left and went to the Patriots, all those kind of targets ended up going to Hooper. So who knows what exactly the Falcons end up doing next season. I expect them to be making a push sometime soon because they have a aging roster as it is. Number 7 on the list is Jared Cook, and he missed 2 games, but he was tight end 1 from week 10 on, and that includes him coming back from an injury and a bye. He had 9 touchdowns, which is where a lot of his fantasy points came from. He had 16.4 yards per reception, which is first among tight ends with at least 15 receptions. He didn't get a ton of volume, though. He only had 43 receptions, which means he averaged about 3 per game. But this was arguably the best year of his career. He's 32. We don't really know what's going on with Breeze. There's been talk that he's going to retire. There's been talk that maybe he'll come back in a limited capacity. Honestly, I think he'd come back and play the full amount that he's played his entire career. But that's something to watch with Jared Cook. If Breeze doesn't play, who knows what exactly that offense looks like. There were 21 points separating him from the next person on this list. At number 8 was Tyler Higbee, and he had 43 receptions in the last 5 weeks of the season. He was tight end 1 through the fantasy playoffs, and that's going to boost his ADP going into next season quite a bit. He was tight end 36 weeks 1 through 12, though. You picked him up late, and you were happy with him. But does his role carry over? Gerald Everett missed weeks 13, 14, 15, and only played a few snaps in weeks 16 and 17. So who knows if Everett comes back and takes over that tight end role. He only had 3 touchdowns, and so his numbers weren't super inflated or fluky, but the opportunity was really there for Tyler Higbee. The Rams offense seems to shift focus quite a bit. Last season, Gurley had a huge year. At the beginning of the season, Kupp was going off. Late in the season, Woods was going off. Extremely late in the season, Higbee went off. So who knows exactly who you can count on in the Rams offense. Number 9 on this list is Hunter Henry. And the alliteration makes him sound like a superhero, but trust me, he's not. He missed 4 games this season, and he has real problems staying healthy. And it's not really a bang-up type of injury that he gets. It's more of like a bad luck injury. So maybe he does have a superpower, and it's just bad luck. He's a free agent, so the question is, where does he go? If he does stay with the Chargers, the question is, who's that quarterback going to be? It seems like they've basically written off Phillip Rivers. So are they going to have Tyrod Taylor be the guy? If that's the case, I don't know that I trust Hunter Henry a whole lot. And he's never played a full 16 games. So is he a guy that you can really trust as your starting tight end, the guy that you're going to draft to hopefully play week in, week out? Number 10 on the list was Dallas Goedert. And he was second on the Eagles, which is crazy. He was the second tight end from the same team, which shows you how hard it is to predict the tight end landscape outside of like 3 or 4 guys. The best thing about Dallas Goedert is there's a reasonable way you can mispronounce his name to make it sound like Joe Dirt. I wonder if that's ever happened. He averaged 7.7 fantasy points per game, which isn't awesome. That's not something you really want. You could stream him late in the season because of injuries in Philly, but honestly, he was very dependent on touchdowns. He only had 2 games with under 80% snaps after the bye week, so those 2 tight end sets really did seem to take hold in Philadelphia. He had 5 touchdowns, and he had a lot of end zone targets because he's a big body. So he's somebody who could build a season on touchdowns. But how can you draft the number 2 tight end from a team as your starter? That's my biggest problem with Goddard, is I don't necessarily want a guy who's not the number 1 tight end on his team. If you weren't already feeling ill, let's move on to our next tight end, Mike Gesicki. Get it? Because his last name has the word sick in it, and the rest of the tight end landscape is gross. He averaged 6.9, which also isn't a lot of fantasy points. And like most tight ends, he was completely touchdown dependent. He got better after Preston Williams went on IR, but that's only because there were limited receiving options. He's going into his 3rd year, which is basically the year you watch tight ends for a breakout, and he's got some great combine scores, so he seems athletic enough to have a possible breakout. But Chan Gailey is the new offensive coordinator in Miami, and unless things change, in the past, Chan Gailey has not utilized the tight end very much at all. If Tua goes to Miami, he's valuable in Dynasty maybe, because Tua's probably going to end up being a good NFL quarterback, and he might be worth watching early next season, but I don't know if he's worth drafting. He's somebody that I would put on my watch list and maybe pick up after the first couple weeks off of waivers. Number 12 on the list is Jason Witten, and he's the definition of average. He only had 3 games over 10 points. The good news with Jason Witten, the best thing he brought us this season, is he stepped away from commenting on Monday Night Football, which allowed Booger McFarland to step in, and that was quite an experience. I don't know if he'll retire again. At the very least, his role with the Cowboys is going to be very limited. Now we're going to jump around a bit. At 14 was Kyle Rudolph. He was tight end 4, though, when Adam Thielen was out, so he's a guy situationally you can count on. Who knows, because they drafted Irv Smith Jr., but they then signed him to an extension. So I don't really know what the plan is at the tight end position with the Minnesota Vikings, but he's somebody to watch if the opportunity arises. At 15 was Darren Fells. And the crazy thing about Fells is over 20% of his receptions went for touchdowns. He didn't really do anything but catch touchdowns. All he did for you this year was ruin your DeAndre Hopkins play. At 18 was Evan Engram. He still hasn't played a full 16. When he's healthy, he's great. When he's not, he doesn't play. And so he's not really somebody you can count on. I don't think I can draft him anymore at this point. At number 29 was O.J. Howard, and he was probably the biggest bust there's been in a while. He had 3 zeros, and Cameron Brate consistently put up better fantasy numbers than him. At tight end 31 was T.J. Hawkinson, and he played more than 1 game, but his numbers could fool you because he had that huge game in week 1. Everybody went out and got him, and then they just saw him basically dump his pants for the remainder of the season. Word is he's going to be training with Tony Gonzalez, but honestly, it seems like he's been training with Harry Houdini because he just disappears. Tight end 33, the last one we're going to talk about today, is Will Disley, and he was tight end 5 when he went on IR in week 6. He only played 6 games, and in one of those games, he left before even catching a pass. So Will Disley is definitely somebody you want to monitor, see how he recovers from that injury, and if he comes back healthy, he might be worth a late-round pick at tight end because he gets used. Russell Wilson trusts him. That's going to do it. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining me. Please subscribe, comment, rate, review, share, scream from the rooftops to spread the word about this podcast. And be sure to follow on Twitter at Fantasy15. That's Fantasy, ONEFIVE. On Facebook at facebook.com/Fantasy15. And email any questions to fantasy15@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. See you next week.